talk a little bit about Ouroboros, the consensus protocol that you guys are working on here for Cardano. What makes this so different from what other chains are building right now?
Well, the first thing that we started with when we started the Cardano project is we actually didn't know if proof of stake was going to work or not. We didn't know if proof of work was the end all be all, and you could never synthetically create proof of work. So the first thing that happened was that we wrote a model called GKL, where we rigorously defined what is a blockchain and what makes it secure, and then what are all the security properties you get for proof of work. So then you have a target. And then the question is, can proof of stake ever emulate that or not? And that's a very controversial thing. If you talk to people from Blockstream or the Bitcoin side of the world, the maximalists, they say that proof of work is holy and nothing can compete with it. And they have all these strong arguments like nothing at stake and long range attacks and grinding attacks and so forth. So then the next part of the Ouroboros agenda, once we had a foundation, was to say, could we synthesize consensus that proof of work does in unrealistic assumptions, meaning like everything works perfectly and everybody's reasonable? Can we even achieve the same things? And that was the first version of Ouroboros, the Ouroboros classic paper. So it's synchronous. You had public stake pools. All this stuff was not optimal. But because it worked, then we had a foundation that we could build on and keep adding new security features and eventually bring it into line so that we could replicate all the security and usability properties that proof of work has. So for example, partial synchrony. Not everybody's going to show up on time, so because it's a distributed system. So some nodes will be delayed and so forth. So we did that. Adaptive security. So we needed things like you don't know who won ahead of time. You only know after the fact, and you can prove that, so people can't sell their votes or a DDoS attack the next delegate or something like that. You need the ability to bootstrap from Genesis. So that's a property where when you join a proof of work system, you can know nothing. What you do is you just get history and you weigh it. You look at the algorithmic weight in each of those chains. You say, well, this one's the heaviest, so that's the longest chain. I'm going to go with that. So you never need a checkpoint. You can just bootstrap from the very beginning of the system and verify that. So we did that with Ouroboros Genesis. We achieved that property. So we've been systematically working our way through every security property that they have, and we created a whole family of papers. I think there's now 6 or 7 of them, and there's more on the way. And that's really what makes Ouroboros special, was that we started from first principles, what is a blockchain, and we kind of worked our way through and said, what properties of Bitcoin do we really like, and we'd like to replicate in terms of how it operates. But then at the same time, we'd like all the benefit of proof of stake. And that's things like very fast finality. You'd like low energy consumption. You can run the whole system on 10 kilowatts of power. The fact that you have endogenous security, meaning security within the system, not endogenous security, exogenous security, security outside of the system, that puts you in a really good position to start optimizing around the stake pool model. So you can use them for layer 2 embedding, like you can add lightning channels or hydra channels or Oracle solutions. In addition to that, you can use them to accelerate the network stack. There's all these things you gain with the proof of stake side of the world in general. Also, the delegation model is really cool because it's a virtual resource. So if China was to ban mining tomorrow, super difficult for the people running mining pools there to get their miners out of China into Mongolia or some other place. When it's a virtual resource, you click a button, you can rehost your server from China to Switzerland or to Liechtenstein or to New Zealand at a click of a button. So you have a much more resilient system in that respect. So there's a huge amount of benefits that proof of stake has, from environmental to performance to sustainability to the ability to layer additional services on that you get for free when you're in that model. But then there's this huge security menu that you have to kind of worry about. And it took us years to work our way through to a point where we got confident enough that we had all those models. And finally, this is a business. When you're running consensus, it's a business. And Satoshi got it right. And that's why we have giant mining warehouses in Georgia and Norway and these other places. So similarly, if you build a business correctly, stake pools should be able to operate every day, make a profit, and still sustain the network without being super expensive and requiring us to print billions of dollars of value every year long term. So we had to figure out the business side of that as well. And that's what we've been doing with the pioneers, what we did with the incentivized testnet over the last 6 months, and what we've been doing with Oxford University and the papers we published there. We're trying to get the game theory right and the model tuning right. And that's been the single hardest thing for Ethereum too. They've been working on that for years as well. And it's not trivial by any sense of the word. So if I had to succinctly say, well, what is Ouroboros? I'd say it's a first principles based new way of doing consensus that keeps the stuff we've come to know and love from Bitcoin that's very useful and great, but then does it in a much more sustainable, energy friendly way that also allows you to layer on many more utilities than just mining to the system and does so in a way that attracts lots of competition, lots of decentralization, and lots of businesses. Mining tends to centralize to a small group of actors because of economy of scale. The way we've designed the system over time, our hope is it gets more decentralized. So right now we're targeting 1,000 stake pools. We could envision in the future 10,000 or 100,000 or something like that, and future iterations of the protocol, and different ways of measuring security above and beyond just ownership of the token, perhaps a proof of merit type of a system. So this is the beauty of Ouroboros, and it's all been done in the academic circle. We've had more than 10 universities be affiliated in the development of Ouroboros throughout its life cycle. These papers we write aren't just white papers, they're actually scientific papers, and they go through the peer review process just like the signatures go through, or any of their form of cryptography goes through. And the people who read those papers aren't cryptocurrency people. They're actual academic cryptographers and mathematicians and computer scientists at conferences that are 40 years old. And the conferences we submit them to, like Crypto and Eurocrypt and CCS, the acceptance rate is, in some cases, 10% or 15% of the papers submitted. But we got in consistently here, which meant we met the threshold of peer review and due diligence. So it's a very different thing than a normal consensus protocol. It's a family of them, not just one. It's been built in a very first principles way, and it's been built with peer review and formal methods to try to tease out these things. And it's been built lockstep with the community to make sure that the game theory matches reality and that it ends up being a sustainable protocol. And we've validated that with the incentivized testnet and the Pioneer testnet.
Very, very interesting. It's this academic process of getting, everything checked and having these papers written up, and it's a time-consuming process, but it's a process that I believe, and I think a lot of Cardano supporters believe, in the end is really going to be a process that wins out in terms of what is finally delivered.
This is the single biggest misnomer, I think, about the process, is it ultimately is faster for certain types of research. So if you contrast Casper to what we've done, what's happened with Casper is they have this giant ball of stuff that they have to do, design requirements. And so they write a protocol and it works until it doesn't. They go back to the drawing board, write a protocol, it works until it doesn't. They go back to the drawing board. And that iterative hacker mentality, it just keeps going and going. And it's like, how long is a piece of string? And then eventually they're like, maybe we have something. And they've been working on this since 2014. So that's like 6 years of like constant effort. With the academic process, you divide and conquer. So you say, what are the fundamental problems that first and foremost we have to study and understand? So before you even build a consensus protocol, you have to have a good definition of what are you trying to reach consensus about. So that's what the blockchain formal definition is about. Then you say, okay, what security properties are important? And then you divide and conquer. You say, okay, well, I can't solve all those security properties in the first protocol design, so let me try to solve the most important ones. Then you systematically walk your way through adding more complexity to the protocol where necessary, like, for example, going from MPC way of generating random numbers to a VRF. Okay, so you do that and you get faster and you get more participation and you get adaptive security and all this other stuff, but then you have to come up with more elegant stuff for that. But every time you build a layer, you know the layers you're building on are already done. So you're laying a firm foundation. The other way, the Casper way that they've been doing through with ETH has been, well, it didn't work, throw it all out, let's start a new model. It didn't work, throw it all out, start a new model. And they just keep going and going until they finally find something they think works. You have no security proofs. You have no guarantees that the foundations are solid. And then usually you have trade-offs that you don't really tell people that are pretty nasty. Like, for example, when you go to a sharded ledger solution like they have, you don't have 50% Byzantine resistance. You have a third to a quarter. So you lose security when you expand the system, and then you just say, well, that's the way it has to be. And so, well, that's not necessarily true because you didn't start from first principles. The other thing is you don't have a lingua franca. So when you go with this foundational approach to the scientific method, then every single researcher in the entire space who's thinking about those problems has read your paper, understands what you're trying to do, and then occasionally comes to you and says, there's a better way of doing things. If you look at Ouroboros itself, the first paper we wrote in the series, I think there's almost 800 citations on it, which means 800 other papers that are doing work related to our work have read and cited our paper, and in many cases interacted with our scientists. So instead of just a small team of researchers or a moderate-sized team of researchers working on it, you now have the entire totality of the industry, of the cryptography community, the distributed systems community, who are now thinking about these things. That's a huge benefit because I don't have to pay them. they're just working for free. They're providing these ideas for free. Recently, for example, Pramod Viswani out of University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, just as an example of this, noticed there were some ways to optimize the approach we were doing proof of stake. And he created his own variant called Nakamoto proof of stake and published his own paper based on our work. So we wrote something and inspired a completely independent team at UIUC and Stanford to then write their own paper and produce their own ideas based on our ideas, inspired by our ideas, and go extend capabilities in a new dimension. And because we're all building on the same type of foundations, the things they've done, we potentially could easily plug into our system. So that's the point about sustainability of research. You have to build as a centralized brain. You cannot have a cult of personality around one team or one person, no matter how brilliant they are, because what happens when they die? What happens when they retire? What happens when they move on? You need to build a culture and an ethos that you're all talking the same language, and anybody anywhere in the world, no matter what university they're at, where they're at, can write a scientific paper, and they know that that idea can inspire or drag something in. We've even been inspiring some of the Ethereum community. For example, Parity Labs, Parity Tech has been writing papers on Ouroboros with variants. So they've changed some of the clock stuff, and they published their own Ouroboros paper that they're using in Parity substrate. So it gives you a sense of this cross-pollination that can occur when you have these good ideas. When you follow the approach Casper's followed, it's slower. They've been working on it longer, and they still haven't launched their product, whereas ours is imminent. And then also nobody can copy it until the very final thing is done, and they have to reverse engineer it and figure out how it works. And then also, in many cases, it's going to be incompatible with where the state of the scientific community is at. So if they wanted to adopt anything that came, like Avalanche or other things that are coming, they just can't integrate it in. It's not compatible. There's an impedance mismatch there. So it seems faster because you can get your first result faster. But when you actually are thinking about the long-term growth of the ecosystem and the long-term evolution of the ecosystem, you end up being substantially slower because you have to throw away lots of steps over and over again, whereas we get to keep all of them.